The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to Reproaction's Act and Learn webinar for August 2020. We're very excited to discuss today's important topic with you. It is housing is a reproductive justice issue. So first we'll introduce our hosts. First voice you're hearing is Erin Matson. I'm one of the co-founders and co-directors of Reproaction. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in Arlington, Virginia, and you can find me on Twitter at Erin to the Max.
And this is the second voice you're hearing is Pamela Merritt. I'm the other co-founder and co-director of Reproaction. My pronouns are she and her. I'm based in St. Louis, Missouri, and you can follow me or find me on Twitter rather at SharkFoo. So we're super excited for today's topic, and it is both timely and incredibly urgent issue of housing as a reproductive justice issue. For the agenda today, we're going to introduce Reproaction to any attendees who aren't familiar with our organization. I'm going to introduce the topic of housing is a reproductive justice issue. And then we're going to dive right into our panel discussion. We are very honored to have with us today Laura Gulley, who is the Director of Community Mobilization and Advocacy at Generate Health St. Louis, and Ingress Moran, who is the lead organizer of Tenants and Workers United. And after that discussion, Erin will go through some next steps, and then I will moderate a Q&A. Throughout this webinar, if you have questions, please go to your GoToWebinar panel and drop them into the question tab. You don't have to wait until the Q&A, just drop the questions in, and at the Q&A, I will get through as many as I can. And then, as always, the hashtag for live tweeting is Reproaction. Reproaction leads bold action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We are proud of our left flank analysis, our willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable, whether they identify as allies or opposition, and our commitment to nonviolent direct action. So the topic for today is housing as a reproductive justice issue. And a lot of the housing issues or discussions that have been happening have been framed as coming or being created by the pandemic. And the reality is that housing as a reproductive justice issue has been an urgent concern for the last 150, if not longer, years. So many people face insecure housing, are unhoused, are being discriminated against, and that predates the pandemic. And the fact that we have not addressed it shows that leadership in order to address reproductive justice issues like housing has not been there and has not been taking these issues seriously. When I think about housing now during the pandemic, I'm mindful of the fact that when we talk about students returning to school, returning to college, and not being able to actually go to their university and access housing there, that for many of those students, that means that they don't have any place to live. And I know that personally because when I was going to college in the early 1990s, housing for me was my campus. My mother had separated from my father, and she was living with my grandmother, and I didn't exactly have a permanent address. So we have to be mindful that people who are experiencing housing insecurity or discrimination are experiencing the weight of this pandemic on top of that. And it's not just as simple as saying that housing suddenly became an issue because of the pandemic and people no longer being able to pay their rent. Next slide. The other way that we need to frame housing as a reproductive justice issue is substandard housing, and not just public housing, but that certainly encompasses public housing. And the fact that for reproductive justice activists, we are working to build a world where people have the right to decide whether or not to parent, have the supports to parent their families as they choose, and to live in communities that are free of violence and oppression. For so many people in my home city of St. Louis and across the country, in every single state and territory in the United States, are dealing with substandard housing. There are people who do not have proper sanitation, don't have running water, and there are people in major urban areas that are living in housing that is dangerous, that makes them sick, and that puts their reproductive future and their children at risk. We can't improve infant and maternal mortality rates, which are horrible, the worst in the developed world in the United States, until we address all of the factors, including housing, that impact people's ability to live healthy and productive lives. Next slide. So there are an estimated 553,742 people, that's a lot of people, in the United States experiencing homelessness on any given night. About 6 million homes in the United States are substandard, and that statistic has not changed very much over the last 2 decades. National, state, and local political leaders have failed to manage the COVID pandemic, and more families face the prospect of eviction. As we organize for housing justice, it is critical to consider how eviction impacts health and health equity, and to advance policies that will minimize that impact. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Laura Gulley, who is organizing for justice here in the St. Louis area. So I know Laura very well. Laura is Director of Community Mobilization and Advocacy for Generate Health St. Louis. She provides oversight to regional multi-sector health initiatives striving to achieve zero racial disparities in infant mortality and maternal health in the St. Louis region. She is most notably has led a community call to action effort to address deplorable housing conditions of low-income families in one of the largest housing complexes in the city of St. Louis. Her resolve and her leadership and her amazing calm helped unite advocates to hold leaders accountable for improving housing conditions and practices. And Laura holds a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology and sociology from Peru State College and a Master's of Social Work degree from the University of Nebraska at Omaha. You can follow Generate Health on Twitter, GenHealthSTL, and you can visit their website, generatehealthstl.org. Laura, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. Thank you so much for joining us. So let's dive right in. So Reproaction has had the pleasure of organizing with you and with Generate Health St. Louis and Missouri for several years. If you could, for our attendees who are not familiar with Generate Health St. Louis, if you could just share the mission of your organization and what specific issues you, Generate Health works on.
Absolutely. So Generate Health has been around for about 20 years, and our role in the community is around mobilizing and inspiring our region to advance racial equity in pregnancy outcomes, family well-being, and overall community health. And we do that by convening. We bring folks together, and I say, you know, unlikely parties that wouldn't ordinarily see themselves in the same space, or even see themselves a part of maternal and child health. And so we bring those folks together, we call stakeholders, to problem solve, and we do that by centering those with lived experience. And so it's not enough to get academia in the room or professional providers in the room to try and address some of the challenges with access and barriers and the like, but to have those by some of the systems and policies that we're seeking to improve center and help us better understand actually how they're experiencing things and potentially address them. So we find ourselves unlikely expand the spectrum around how do we address some of the racial inequities and the disparities that continually plague our community. So we have this huge, I want to say big audacious goal and vision of having a region that would have zero racial disparities in infant and maternal health. And so that is what we're seeking to do. But as part of some of the initiatives, so like you can't do this work by staying pie in the sky. You have to be on the ground, understanding what's happening in community, partnering with those that are not just trying to access services, but those that are trying to deliver them. And so that's what we find ourselves doing, addressing issues from safe sleep to accessing prenatal care, to family planning services, to even transportation and housing, and helping us to better understand how we can improve the overall well-being of moms and babies. And so that's what we've traditionally been working on the last 20 years.
Thank you so much for that. And I can personally attest to just the strong leadership and the roots that Generate Health has in so many communities in St. Louis. So in thinking of that, I came to know Generate Health St. Louis and you, Laura, through the work that you are doing in community with people who are most impacted and or experiencing maternal and infant or infant mortality. And so, in specifically thinking of Black women and infants in the St. Louis metropolitan area. Housing is key to establishing and maintaining healthy communities and a healthy family. So, what are some of the housing issues that you hear about or that your colleagues hear about at Generate Health St. Louis that people are facing in St. Louis?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna kind of go back, but I just want to talk about currently. Mm-hmm. You know, we're talking about folks that are having or struggling to pay their rent. And this is, it adds to the level of stress, and we call this toxic stress that families experience on a day-to-day basis of not knowing where they're going to lay their head at night, or stressing over how they're going to make ends meet. And so that certainly adds to the overall stress of families' experience. But even prior to COVID, housing in particularly for the St. Louis region is we have a large housing stock of old housing stock. And, you know, simply what that means is the quality isn't that great for those lower income families that have to search and find safe spaces for their families. And so some of the issues that elevate are around, there's not enough quality housing, but then those that they are able to find are the challenges with ensuring that the space is safe for their children to be in. Mm-hmm. So running water, the utilities, the physical environment, and then many of the housing that lower income families are able to access aren't located in the best neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And the surrounding environment adds to another layer of stress. So when you talk about going outside to, as we say, well, you should be exercising and getting out to, enjoy fresh air when it's not simply safe to do so. And so that looks a little bit different for families that find themselves in environments like that aren't conducive to just walking out your front door. So that really creates challenges for families to exercise what we say are your normal ways of being healthy, and then walking to and from grocery stores that may not exist in your neighborhood. So there's a cumulative effect, I believe, that families are faced in our community.
Thank you for that. Just to touch on the issue of toxic stress, which I was not even familiar with until a couple of years ago, and I heard it on a local news report that so many people in the St. Louis area are likely suffering from toxic stress and heightened anxiety simply because of racial injustice and police violence against Black and Brown people. But I'm also mindful of the fact that so many, because of the situation you just described, Laura, of people not having access to safe or stable housing, that there's the stress of just having to relocate all the time. And that when I first moved back to St. Louis, I volunteered at transitional shelters. And I realized that so many of the women who were there were basically hopping from one family member's home to another family member's home to another family member's home because they weren't able to get through the system and access stable housing. And they were obviously taking their babies with them as they went. And I'm also mindful that that impacts people's ability to get their kids to school because the mail doesn't follow you to your auntie's house, to your grandmother's house. So thank you for lifting that up, because I think a lot of people look around their communities and are thinking, how can you have a housing problem? And if the building isn't safe, then it doesn't get counted as a viable option. So moving forward, let's get specific. Like a lot of people in the St. Louis region, I was horrified but not surprised, but horrified to learn of the conditions people were forced to live in specifically at the Clinton Peabody Public Housing Complex in St. Louis. But that is an example of many substandard housing complexes throughout the country. And at Clinton Peabody specifically, families were faced with mice infestation, unsafe structures, and they were not able to get any resolution for quite a significant amount of time. So if you would, Laura, if you could please share how issues at Clinton compounded, and then how did Generate Health get involved, and what were you able to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So the issue around what you're elevating around what happened in Clinton Peabody, I don't know that it's unique to St. Louis in terms of having an environmental, the physical environment was not healthy. That went on for generations. So imagine growing up in an environment where you became used to pests living with you. You became used to maintenance orders not being filled. That became the norm. And then pretty soon you just began to just live with the conditions. And it wasn't until we're having a convening of leaders, one of our initiatives called Flourish St. Louis that was addressing infant mortality in our region. We had one priority that was focused on safe sleep. And we were issuing this kind of moratorium on wanting the community to rally around safe sleep practices. And we had a community member that happened to reside in Clinton Peabody, just kind of quietly used his voice to say, you know, while you all are talking about safe sleep practices of keeping your baby, you know, placing your baby alone in the crib, and that's not what my community looks like. And we have families that experience something very different because they're quite frankly scared to have their children placed in cribs by themselves because the mice infestation. And raise the issue and challenge leaders to dig deeper and to understand it wasn't just the physical environment that was failing them. It was the housing system. It was the public health system. It was the health system. It was all of these systems operating in a siloistic way that was not meeting the needs of those that they were designed to serve. And Generate Health found its role of elevating the concerns of those residents to say what they're experiencing is real. So acknowledging and validating those experiences were so important. And to then begin to hold conversations, community conversations, elected officials, boards of commissioners that were overseeing these bodies to say, there is somebody accountable to have a safe and affordable housing. And how do we get to that place? And it was not going from A to B and reaching a solution. We went around the corner. We had tough conversations that actually led to legal engagement of our legal community getting involved and taking it to the highest court in Missouri, our Missouri Attorney General, to issue some requirements for things to change. And I say that to say it was the convening of all of these systems that really helped better understand what should this be, how should this look different, and how can it be more responsive to those that they're supposed to serve. And the last thing I'll say about this is the residents also had to be empowered. And I hate using that word, but because I believe people already have that inherent power. It was tapping into that power to say, you have rights. Let me help you understand what those look like. And how could you utilize that power that you have to create change? Because once we walk out the door, you still have to live here. And how can you get what you need for your family to be safe? And so that's what is still happening on the ground, because we're talking about generational kinds of change and ingrained conditioning of what that mindset of poverty sets us up for. And so that we do have an organization on the ground, Action St. Louis, working in community with those residents, along with the housing authority, to create or reimagine something different.
Amazing, amazing, and it's hard to truly express just how impactful and powerful that moment was, and to see people find their voice and demand better. It was inspiring, even though the conditions were, as I said, horrific. So thank you for
and Pam,
yes,
you're right. We had families that shared. We have one family that talked about, I killed 52 mice in my unit alone. So we're not talking about just kind of sweeping under the rug here or there, just come in and spray. We're talking about these mice and pests were in the walls and in the crawl spaces, and it was an all out we have to start over and really look at how we're going to address this differently moving forward. So
yes, thank you. Sometimes you just have to keep it real and talk about exactly what people were faced with, and that is an accurate description of what people were trying to navigate in their home. So thank you so much for putting that all into context and explaining the work that happened in coalition. And so in the time that we have left, I think it would be helpful for our attendees to hear any advice that you have for residents who are facing substandard housing conditions and may want to find a way to address it and organize and come together.
Yeah, absolutely. So several things that kind of come up for me around this. What do we do? How do we take action? And to know, you're not alone, and that there are entities like legal services for St. Louis. It was the legal services of St. Louis, of Eastern St. Louis, that intervened. We also had Equal Opportunity Housing Council that was willing to contribute, and another organization that provided legal support, and that was City Defenders, St. Louis City Defenders.
Art City Defenders.
Arch City, thank you so much, because it wasn't coming, right? But Arch City that also contributed legal supports, because residents needed to understand what their rights were and what moves and avenues they had at their disposal so that they could take action. And so that, as I think about what what your listeners could potentially do, is to think about what legal resources are available in the communities, but they're also community-based organizations that could be brought together to help support residents in their track to find a resolution.
Fantastic advice. Thank you so much. So Laura, if you'll hold on, we're going to move on to your co-panelist. And then I know that there are already questions that are popping up for the Q&A at the end. Thank you so much, Laura. And again, if you have questions, please do drop them into the question tab at your GoToWebinar control panel. And with that, I'll pass it over to Erin.
Hello, and thank you to Pamela and Laura. That was profound. So I'm very excited to introduce our next panelist, Ingress Moran, who is the lead organizer of Tenants and Workers United, which is based in and serves the Northern Virginia area. Ingress joined the Tenants and Workers United youth group when she was a high school freshman. Since then, she's believed in the values of the organization. She went to school for her associates and bachelor's and came back as staff, and has been organizing young people since 2014 to win change in school policies and other issues impacting our directly impacted communities in Northern Virginia. You can find Tenants Workers on Twitter, and then tenantsandworkers.org for the website. Ingress, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's dive in. So my first question for you is, you'd have to be hiding under a rock not to see that evictions and the lack of access to safe and affordable housing are issues that have been in the news during the COVID-19 pandemic. But what some people may not realize is that these issues are not new, and tenants organizing for justice isn't new. So Tenants and Workers United has been organizing for 30 years in Northern Virginia. How did the organization start organizing for housing justice? How did it come to be, and how did it start organizing?
Sure. And so the organization was founded in the late 80s in Alexandria, Virginia. And more specifically, it was in the neighborhood in Northern Virginia in Alexandria, which at the time it was predominantly a white and Black working class community. But in that time, there was a lot of Latinx folks that were coming in, that were immigrating specifically from El Salvador due to escaping the impoverished conditions they were living in due to the Civil War at the time. That even then, that community is now called Arlandria Chirilawa. So formerly using the name of what it has always been historically called Arlandria to now Chirilawa, which is now a big city in El Salvador. So now it's called Arlandria Chirilawa. And in that time, a lot of the immigrant communities that were living there, specifically in an apartment complex, all of a sudden the managers put signs up in their apartment houses. This is in the late 80s, saying you are going to be evicted in 15 days. And there was no real reason, but because at the time, really the state allowed it, a lot of the immigrant communities were shocked and didn't know what to do, but they did know that this was their new home and that they weren't going to leave. And so the co-founders of the organization, they got together with a few leaders in the community. Primarily, a lot of them were unable to read and write. They just knew that they had to step up and fight for their families to stay in that community that they had already adjusted in. And so since then, they were able to stay. They were able to negotiate. They were able to pressure the manager at the time. They were able to talk to city council members. And since then, the organization truly came to find out and thought that creating change through local grassroots organizing really did make a difference in the community at the local level. And since then, we have been fighting many issues such as housing, education, really. Working with young people has really been the heart of the work, but working with the communities of color, working class folks, women, young people, workers. And so since then, we've been working on many issues, and we just come to find out we always go back to housing because that is such a basic need that we deserve.
Hear, hear. Thank you for that. So indulge me in a little thought experiment. Particularly, let's just set this year of 2020 aside and look at what was happening before the pandemic. Can you tell us and our audience a bit more about the housing situation in Northern Virginia? I know you told us about what was happening in a specific area of Alexandria where Tenants and Workers United came to pass, but can you give us a broader landscape about access to housing in Northern Virginia and what the issues are?
Sure. And so one of the things that has always been is gentrification, just because we've always seen that Northern Virginia is such a metropolitan area because we're near, all these federal buildings, the White House is here, all these government workers, right? So we feel that, it's a very, it's a popular place to be at, live at, go to school at. And so we were always trying to find ways to see how we can help our people, because the rent prices, instead of going down, it was going up, right? And as people's salaries weren't going up because the minimum wage is still $7.25 here in the state of Virginia, right? It wasn't going up as the same rate as our rent prices. And so we've always seen that issue where there's such a huge demand for housing that when we see there be new housing, it doesn't include housing for our families and working class families of color. And it just made it worse when we saw when Amazon announced their arrival in 2018. And since just hearing the announcement, the surrounding neighborhoods just saw a spike in their rent increase, or not necessarily immediately, but when families who had been there for 10 years and they had to renew their annual lease, it had gone dramatically up from up to $250 as a rent increase. And so we knew that all had to do with the Amazon arrival. And so that has something that we have been working with. Not just our community members, but also with our legislators, and especially those in the surrounding areas, such as our elected officials from Arlington and Alexandria, because we knew that they were incentivizing Amazon just for being there, while that money could have gone to our community members. And so since then, we've been pushing more for housing rights for our community members, because every time we see development, we see that it does not include our families, and it's more for our workforce. But at the end of the day, we work with families who are undocumented, right? They are not teachers, they are not firefighters, right? They they are the people who are doing maintenance in the buildings that we work in, or in the restaurants, or they're the ones constructing our building, but yet we feel like they are not included in the housing that is made. And so that was one of the issues we have been seeing before COVID.
Thank you. And I think that's a really important segue, and a nice segue, because what you just highlighted, that the people who are cleaning the buildings and making things work for the entire workforce are essentially essential workers, which brings us to the present. So Tenants and Workers United organizes low-income communities of colors to advance racial, economic, and social justice by fighting for education, housing, and immigrant rights. How has your work on housing justice, but for that matter, I'd like to open the question up, because you are excitingly a multi-issue organization and an intersectional organization. So not just housing justice, but how has your work on housing justice and education justice and immigrant justice changed since the pandemic has come in?
I think for our folks, it has made our community members, because we work directly with the folks who are directly impacted by these issues. I think for our community members, at least for us as staff, it was no surprise when we heard that the zip code our community center is at, which is the 22305 zip code, was one of the highest COVID hotspots in the DMV area, especially Northern Virginia. And that was no surprise to us, because that was where our families were, one, getting sick because they were exposing themselves because they had no option but to work, because they are essential workers, and because the thing about our communities is that many times we're overcrowded, not but because we want to, but because we have no choice. In order to pay the rent, we have to have more than one families in the household. And so that really created a difficult opportunity, where we saw that you cannot not expose yourself when you're having more than one families living in a one-bedroom apartment with 8 people, including children. And so that was what led us to see what the cities, at least the surrounding jurisdictions, were doing to really protect the families. And so that's when we really started pushing, because we started seeing that it was so inaccessible for our families to get tested. People didn't know where to go. Folks were already starting to get behind with rent. And so we saw that this health issue, this health global pandemic was impacting our families in so many levels, especially economically. And so that's when we came to realize how we can really intersect these issues. And that made our families really notice how oppressed they are through the systems that we live in, and how they are directly impacted in the sense that's where they sought to stand up and wanted to know what their rights were during all of this. And that was when we have been working with them even more than ever, knowing that they have so many basic needs. And one of the basic needs is housing, right? Is like, how can they think of education? How can they think of other things when they're maybe about to be evicted soon, right? And so these are the issues that we try to have them understand, that this is a multi-issue, and we have to realize that because of the pandemic, we're more oppressed than ever than other folks, right? And especially the communities of color that are being impacted by all these issues all at the same time.
And what are somebody's options if they're on the brink of being evicted in this current state of support and or lack thereof from public services?
Sure. And so one of the things that we have been pushing for, when we started realizing our folks weren't working either because they were sick or they really lost their job and were laid off, and unfortunately they don't have the benefit of getting unemployment because of their immigration status, we started really pushing at the local level with the City of Housing and find out what were they doing to support. And because we kept pushing, we had our members zooming in with their legislative officials, with our elected officials at the state level. It pushed the City of Housing, at least for the City of Alexandria, to create a $3 million rent relief fund, in which this city money would not require any documentation status, but at least as long as they were Alexandria residents, they can get at least $600 of rent relief for the next 3 months. And that was due to our work and us pushing and setting pressure and letting them know the needs of our communities at this point. And so that was that was a slight relief, but to know that what is $600 with $3,000 that you owe of 2 months rent plus late fees, because we know that these landlords, they were still charging late fees. And so what we had to do is organize our tenants from each apartment complex and to have them negotiate with their landlords. And so one of the things that we've been able to do is a lot of the landlords have been forgiven the late fees, or when it comes to renewing their lease, they either charge probably a 2% increase compared to the 10% increase they would normally have prior COVID. And so we know with the people organizing and stepping up and setting pressure to those in power, they can really make a difference. And so those are the small things that we've created at the local level. But at the state level is one of the things that we were pushing for is we want an increase to the rent relief program there is in the state of Virginia. And we want there to be an extension in the eviction moratorium. Unfortunately, the eviction moratorium is currently effective until September 7th. So that just means that our families are still at risk to having no homes. From what I've seen at the state level of Virginia, there's about 350,000 families in the Commonwealth that are in the risk of having nowhere to go. And so that is one of the things that we're working along with our sister organization, New Virginia Majority, in which they're setting pressure at the state level to ensure that legislative officials during this special session time that they have to extend the eviction moratorium up until March or April of next year, to give families a time to really work and get themselves together economically because of them having unable to have funding or any income these past 5-6 months.
Oh my goodness. Well, congratulations on the victories that you've achieved so far. And September 8th is coming very, very, very quickly. Can you, when that moratorium is currently slated to end, I know that Tenants and Workers United is calling on political leaders to meet a set of demands, and extending the moratorium for eviction is one of them. Are there additional demands, and how can people support this work in Northern Virginia?
I think at this point, because we are a local grassroots organization, there's only a few things we can do in each of our communities that we're working with. But at the end of the day, it's all the families in Virginia that are at risk of losing their homes. And so that's why we're really supporting New Virginia Majority at the state work, legislative work that they're doing, and ensuring that all elected officials support the bills that include the extension of the eviction moratorium, ensuring that the governor redirect the funds for rent relief, because we know that the state of Virginia has CARES Act that they got, but we know that money is ending soon. And so, and even then with that funding, there's a lot of like administrative problems where many times people call for rent relief and either no one picks up the phone, or they're there for hours and they still can't get that connection to get that rent relief fund. So we're hoping that people can send emails to their legislators to support these bills that New Virginia Majority is supporting, which is they have a link at newvirginiamajority.org/stop_evictions. And so I'm happy to send you all that link. But I think the most important thing is, if you're in Virginia, contacting your legislator and letting them know that you want there to be a stop to eviction, because eviction is a violence, right? We're setting our people to be out on the streets. And so, and these are our essential workers that are most at risk, our families of color. And so we're really pushing at the state level with our sister organization to make this happen.
I have been so inspired by your discussion that you've led here. Just briefly, in a minute or so, what advice do you have for people who are listening? Because we've got listeners from all over the country who are hearing this and want to start organizing for housing justice in their communities.
Sure. I would say really work with those that are really directly impacted, hear them out. What are their issues impacting them? What do they see as solutions? I think what's beautiful about grassroots organizing is that you see the people leading the work is the people who are being directly impacted. And it's great to see that like Laura was saying, not necessarily making them feel empowered, because they are already empowered, right? They already have the power. It's just about motivating them and us being as a resource and being behind them to support them and giving them the resources, but just working locally with them. And I think is great. I know we normally do door knocking, but unfortunately we can't at these moments, but being creative in how you can meet with them and talk to them. It's very beautiful to see them do the work and be inspired, even though they have a lot to risk, because unfortunately when they're going against the landlords and such things, or their employees, because they're not providing them their rights, they're risking a lot. And so they need our support, because we have that privilege, right? And so always work with the community surrounding you and hear their needs out.
Thank you. That's very important advice. So with that, I'll say thank you, Ingress. And if folks have questions for Ingress or for Laura, please feel free to put those into the questions tab, and we'll get to as many of them at the end as we can. And I'm going to move on to closing us out on next steps. So just want to encourage you to plug into Reproaction's work. If you sign up for alerts at www.reproaction.org, you won't miss a thing. And we invite you to follow us on social media as well. We are Reproaction on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And please save the date for our next Act and Learn webinar, which will take place on Tuesday, September 29th at 3 p.m. Eastern. The topic next month will be Free Brittany, respecting the autonomy and decision-making of people with disabilities. So we're really looking forward to having that discussion about respecting autonomy and decision-making for people with disabilities, a very important reproductive justice issue. So with that, I will pass it back to Pamela for any Q&A before we close.
Thank you so much, Erin. And couple of questions. All right. So the first question, I'm going to give this to Ingress first and then to Laura. But the questioner says that many people have said to them, or that they believe that people facing a housing crisis got into that situation through bad decisions. So why is this the community's problem? Ingress, would you like to take a stab at that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
Of course. So the question is that the person asking the question says that people have said to them that people who are facing housing issues or discrimination got into that situation through bad decisions. So why is that the community's problem?
Yeah, I think, yeah, definitely. I feel like I hope I'm able to answer this, but in case for the person asking, but I think for our communities is, unfortunately, we're really underneath where we're already behind economically, where we have to face the minimum wage at the state, which at least in Virginia is very low. Mm-hmm. We don't have access to health in terms of whether there aren't enough community clinics, or we don't have insurance if we're undocumented. And so it's the way, in the sense, the way the system is set up, it's set up for us to kind of, in a sense, fail. And so I think for our communities, it's very important to know who is running our country, right? Who is running our state, ensuring that. That's why at the same time, even though we work with many undocumented folks, we encourage them to, whoever is a citizen, encourage them to go out and vote and really empower their community members for them to one day, maybe they have the capacity to have a leadership role one day in their state or in their community. And I think that's one of the things that we have to push for, is knowing that many times the system isn't set up for us, that we have to make sure we change those policies and change policies. So that way we are able to really connect to the resources that will benefit us in so many levels.
Thank you for that. Laura.
Yeah, I would just add of understanding our history, of really understanding how do we get here. I point to some of helping people to understand and recognize where redlining occurred, particularly I'm thinking of in the St. Louis community, but in many communities across our country, from redlining to gentrification that really displaces many people of color or low income individuals, that access to quality housing isn't just because they did something to mismanage their money, or when we really take a look at uncovering the issues, we look at access and the cumulative impact of how things, policies and such have impacted us generational. So I love the fact that we can point to COVID as an example that allows people common experiences, that COVID doesn't discriminate when it comes to how, the impact, or when you experience the need for health. We were all in the same boat. And I just kind of liken that parallel to understanding the impact of COVID allows us to have a little bit more empathy.
Thank you for that. Thank you both. So the next question blends with one I was thinking about. So the question is, what changes are needed to solve the problem with housing? And before you answer, Ingress, I'm going to give it to you first. But before you answer, I'm thinking about like solutions, like hopefully we get an opportunity to reset and build something that doesn't just patch the system, but actually helps us address some of the issues and causes that both you and Laura have shared with us today. So what changes in that reset would you like to see or are needed to solve the problem of housing?
I always say resources. I think we truly need funding in order to, because housing here, at least in Virginia, is so expensive. We have one bedroom apartment, minimum $1,500 plus utilities. And so that makes it really difficult for our families, and something that we've always pushed for and hoping and dreaming one day as an organization is duplicate what we were able to do, which was build a housing cooperative right in the neighborhood where we were founded at. So those apartment complexes that I started out with, that we managed the people to stay there. 15 years later, we managed to have that community become a housing cooperative. And so that means they are owners of their own apartments. And so we did have a lot of legal support, city support, that we were able to buy that off, but it's no longer part of Tenants and Workers United, but we still have many of our leaders who still live there. But to know that those communities right there, one bedroom apartment is probably not even half of what people across the street live. They may still be in the same conditions, but to know that they are in control of their own homes, even though they are apartments. And so I think that's something that we've always ideally want to create here in the city, is having community land use, and community decides what they want to do with that land and have it be housing. And so also in ensuring that the cities, they check in with our community members first, because many times they just allow and give the permits off to the developers without realizing, who will those developments really benefit them, right? Including bonus density, and that way, we can have taller buildings for more housing that will include our families with the medium income that they have, which is 40% or low. That usually is where our families qualify. And so that's what we're hoping for. I think always more resources.
Thank you so much. Laura.
Well, that sounded exciting to hear you talk about, Ingrid, the co-op idea. One of the things that I think about solution-wise is really investing in that infrastructure. We have a lot now. The conversations are, we don't have the funds, or we're, using them differently. And what would it look like to redistribute resources? And particularly there are, and I don't know what it's like in other parts of the country, but affordable housing trusts that or taxable incomes or dollars that go in a pool that can contribute to enhancing the quality of life in affordable housing projects, the housing related services that would improve the housing stock, from modifications to home repair to investing and supporting our homeless population or the unhoused. So, there are different ways that we can look at how we utilize our existing resources to better service families better.
Thank you so much. So that actually brings us to an end of our webinar. I would like to, on behalf of Reproaction and our attendees, to thank Laura Gulley with Generate Health St. Louis and Ingress Moran at Tenants and Workers United. Thank you for lending your expertise and your thoughts and experiences and sharing all of that with our attendees. As always, thank you to Erin Matson, my co-director in this quest for justice, for manning the helm of our GoToWebinar control panel. And thank you to our attendees. And we hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day and that you are inspired to do some organizing around housing and housing justice in your community. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.